the previous film, we saw how UAD-powered plugins can be used to shape and control the tone and dynamic sections of various parts of your mix by focusing on some key EQ and compression settings. In this film, we're going to be moving on to looking at spatial effects, turning again to UAD-powered plugins for reverberation and delay options. Let's start by adding some reverb to the vocal part. For this, we're going to turn to the Lexicon 224 plugin, which I'm going to set up on an auxiliary bus so that this effect is going to be available to other parts within the mix as well. The Lexicon 224 is a multi-mode reverb, and you can see that the vocal plate setting is one of just a number available here at the top. The sliders below allow us to configure this sound, and we can begin by changing the reverb time for different parts of the frequency spectrum. We want any bass frequencies to disappear quite quickly, so we're selecting 1.8 seconds here, whereas mid-range content can afford to decay more slowly, so we're going to select 2.8 here. The crossover dial allows me to select the frequency between these two different parts of the frequency range, and I'm going to choose 780 Hz to separate those two bands here. Independently, I've got treble decay, and that allows me to roll off any unneeded high frequency content to prevent the reverb becoming too fizzy. I'm going to select 7.5 kHz here. We also have a pre-delay control, which is going to offset how quickly the reverb starts. Let's have a listen to this effect now in context on the vocal part.
You always take the best of me. You always leave the rest of me.
That's working nicely, so let's add that reverb to the other two vocal parts as well via the same auxiliary bus. However, the sound we want for this mix is quite lush, so as well as the Lexicon 224, we're going to turn to another reverb, this time using the AMS RMX16. We're going to set that up on auxiliary bus number 2. Like the Lexicon 224, this is a multi-mode reverb, and we can select different programs over here on the right. The one we want is ambience, which is going to give us a really long, lush sound. In fact, we're going to dial in up to 5 seconds of this reverb, before then attenuating low and high frequency content to taste so that we can roll out low and high frequency content again to prevent the reverb from becoming too overwhelming. Let's hear that on this vocal part as well.
You always take the best of me. You always leave the rest of me.
Again, we have a pre-delay control here, so we can offset the start of the reverb if we want to a little bit. Let's also add that effect to these other two vocal parts before we hear these effects in context.
You always take the best of me. You always leave the rest of me.
So now we've started adding some space to the vocal parts. For the guitars, we can use the reverb treatment we've set up for the vocal, but let's also set up a darker, more individual reverb treatment. We're using the AKG BX20 for this purpose, set up on the first insert slot of the first guitar part. Like many UAD powered plugins, the BX20 features presets designed by Leading Lights from production and mixing, and from the factory preset list, we're selecting Guitar Spread Left. This is a stereo reverb, but what we can do is to place pan dials around the position of the original guitar part in order to narrow the reverb response to the same position as the dry signal. Let's have a listen to that in context. That's the reverb by itself, so now let's set a balance between the dry signal and the wet signal. And now let's hear that guitar part in context with a little reverb. That's working nicely, so we're going to copy the BX20 treatment across to the other guitar part, remembering to open it up and to select individual pan positions for this second part, which is panned a little over towards the right. We're also going to add both the Lexicon 224 and AMS RMX16 treatments set up for the vocal so that the mix glues together a little better. Let's hear those in the track now.
You always take the best of me. You always leave the rest of me.
So now we've got both shared and individual reverb treatments on the parts that we recorded at Real World Studios. We also want to add some delays to the guitar parts to smudge their insistent rhythms a little. We're going to use the EP34 for this purpose, which provides an accurate emulation of this classic tape echo. To set this up, the first thing we're going to do is to sync delay time to tempo by clicking the sync button. And because this is an auxiliary bus, we're also going to make sure that the signal is 100% wet. We can choose a delay time here using this slider, and we're going to select a dotted eighth note. We have a chance to control the decay and delay repeats using both the repeats and the recording dial here, which allows us to control how much of this signal will be sent against the virtual tape head at the heart of this plugin. Overcooking these two dials will provide howling feedback, but if we set up the dials correctly, we should end up with some wonderfully warm, rich delay. Let's have a listen. That's producing a wonderful vintage sound. Let's add it to the other guitar part as well.
The rest of me.
So now we've added two types of spatial effect, reverb and delay. So we've added reverb and delay treatments to the parts that we recorded at Real World Studios, but to help glue the mix together, we're now going to add some of those treatments to the parts within our programmed backing track. Let's add a little of both the reverb treatments to the clap and snare parts first of all. And let's do the same thing with the two pulsing synth parts, as well as adding a little delay here. Finally, let's give a little bit of space to the crash cymbal and hi-hat parts.
You always take the best of me. You always leave the rest of me.
Now the mix is really starting to glue together with the spatial treatments we've set up in this episode. In this film, we've selected and applied some of the reverb and delay options from the vast array of possibilities afforded by the UAD powered plugins bundle. In the next film, we'll add some individual effects to particular elements of our mix.